That second reading about the married woman and the single woman definitely requires a homily. The holiest women I have known in my life were married women, mothers and parents. But nonetheless, Paul is writing, anticipating the end of the world, and you have to put this into context. But since our homiletic time is very restricted, I'm going to pass on St. Paul to Corinth and speak about the gospel reading. This gospel is set in Capharnaum. Caphar means a village or a town of Naum, whoever that was a person. It's set on the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee. And I know many of you pilgrims have been to Capharnaum, and some of you will be there again in just a few weeks on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It becomes the hometown of Jesus, and he will do many miracles and have many times of teaching there. And this is recorded in all three Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels. In chapter 4 there of Matthew, we're reading chapter 1 here of Mark, and it's in chapter 4 in the Gospel of Luke. And it's the first great miracle. It's the inauguration of the public life of Christ. There's a synagogue there. Even today, there's a synagogue. The synagogue there today is a 3rd century synagogue, but it's on the footprint of the original synagogue mentioned in this gospel, and probably has the configuration of the synagogue known to Jesus in which this gospel is set. What's also of some interest to us is Jesus preaches and teaches in the synagogue. You'll find that also in the beginning of the 4th chapter of Matthew or of Luke, where Jesus preaches in the synagogue at Nazareth. And now he goes to Capernaum, and he's going to preach there in the synagogue, and that's part of the record of today's gospel. There's a man there with an unclean spirit. He comes into the synagogue, a prisoner of the unclean spirit, and he leaves a free man. Now that becomes a very important element in this narrative. Jesus speaks with authority, with the power of authority, not like the scribes who were quoting others, but Jesus speaks with an extraordinary personal messianic power. And he demonstrates the authenticity of this power by the manner in which he drives out this evil spirit from the man, the unclean spirit. Prompted to look at this, prompted by the theology of Pope Francis, who invokes very much Francis of Assisi theology, I went back and I began to read some of St. Bonaventure, the mystical theologian, the first great theologian in the Franciscan tradition, and he was followed by a fellow called Duns Scotus, who was also an eminent theologian in the Franciscan tradition. And St. Bonaventure and Duns Scotus subsequently say that the incarnation, God becoming human, did not happen primarily because of sin. They don't deny the presence of sin, but they say it doesn't happen primarily because of sin. It happens because humanity and creation is incomplete, and somehow the messianic presence of God in Jesus Christ is there to complete creation, the creation which is wanting, to restore the dignity of the person, to reclaim the original goodness in the person, to affirm the person's likeness to the original creation, the likeness to the Creator. That becomes the mission. The messianic statement that appears here is the triumph of light over darkness, of goodness over evil, the triumph of purity over the unclean spirit. Very powerful symbolism here about the messianic message, the proclamation of who Jesus is and why he is walking among us in these gospel texts. If you read the beginning of the chapter 4 there in Luke's gospel, you'll find that Jesus begins his public ministry in Nazareth. And remember, he goes into the synagogue in Nazareth, and he's handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he begins by saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and I am sent to give sight to the blind, to set prisoners free, to preach the good news to the poor." This becomes the mantra, the proclamation of the mission of the Messiah. And he is rejected at Nazareth in his hometown, and then he moves to Capernaum, where this becomes the first miracle of his public life, mentioned there after the Nazareth event mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. What does this mean to us? Is this something very distant, or does it have a real meaning for us? I mean, has Jesus come among us to restore our dignity, to somehow teach us about our original blessing, to reinforce our identity as children, sons and daughters of God? Bonaventure goes on to say, the authority, the power of Jesus Christ is his humility. The power of God becoming present in Jesus Christ is the humility of God. The strength of the proclamation is the weakness, which means the strength doesn't coerce, it doesn't intimidate, it doesn't separate, and it doesn't judge. It's that kind of power. The exalted status of God revealed in Jesus Christ is the status of a servant, the one who comes to serve. It's the language of the soul. Allow this to speak to us. Last week I had a huge argument with somebody. Well, somebody had a huge argument with me, but I thought I was right. And the other person thought the other person was right. Well, of course, I won because I dismissed the other person. That's one way to win an argument, is just dismiss the other person. It's one of those Pyrrhic victories, where there is no winner. The real winner is the one who doesn't think he won, but knows he lost. That's the real winner. Because that's the enlightened person. And I knew, after this confrontation, I knew that I was diminished. I knew that I was less. I knew somehow that I offended the dignity and the nobility of my original goodness. There was something that was wounded inside of me. My soul somehow was touched. And the presence of Jesus is to restore and to renew the sense of dignity inside of us. To allow light to displace darkness, goodness to displace evil. So we live in a warrior culture, and we have a Super Bowl today. We're going to pay a huge tribute to those who are the biggest, the strongest, the most destructive, the fastest, the wildest. That's our culture. It is our culture. We're making a lot of money these days on the movie about the sniper. And Wall Street and the whole world is driven by this intense and absolute necessity to win, to conquer. Not to serve, not to be kind, not to be gracious, but to win. I think it must be part of the mentality of our culture. And in a way, it invades every one of us in some way. And Jesus comes among us to say, there is a gospel. There is a teaching to honor your original dignity. In the rabbinic tradition, this parable is told when the rabbi asks the students, when is night over and when does day begin? When is the darkness? When does it cease and when does light begin? And one student says, when looking at a distance, you can see the difference between a dog and a sheep. And another says, when you can see the difference between a fig tree and an olive tree. And a third says, when you can see the lines in the palm of your hand, the night is over and the day has begun. And the rabbi says, no. When you can look in the face of every man and every woman and see your brother and see your sister, until that time, it is still night and we are still in darkness. We haven't honored the nobility within us. We haven't mined the goodness of our original creation, and we haven't seen the presence of God in all people. Until that time, says the rabbi, we are still in darkness, and the dawn has not happened. When we were very young, we learned the fables of Aesop. Whoever Aesop was, he's some Greek person way back there, 500-600 years before Christ, and the fable is attached to him because we don't know who he was or even if he was. But one of Aesop's fables that I can still remember since I was very young was the contest between the wind and the sun. Which is the most powerful and which can affect the better result? And so the fable tells us the sun hides behind a cloud, and the wind says, I'll go first, and the wind blows, and this traveler is walking with his overcoat on, or his cloak, and who will get him to take off his cloak? And the wind blows, and the strength of the wind and the power of the wind blows, and the man ties his cloak or his coat around him even more. And the more the wind blows and the more the violence and the power of the wind is exercised, the more he covers up. And then the sun comes out, and the sun warms him as if with kindness, and warms him with the embrace. And then he opens his coat or takes off his cloak, and the teaching is that to see the inner person, to discover the goodness, to see the beauty will require the warmth of the sun, not the power of the wind. That's the original dignity. That's the teaching that comes from this gospel. So the next time you have that argument, or the next time I have that argument, I will remember this gospel to say, how do I arrange myself in my family? How do I arrange myself in my community or with my co-workers or wherever I am? How do I arrange myself to be the person of warmth, the person of gift, the person of blessing, the one who brings light into the world? How do I become the Christ figure to restore in myself first, so that then I can restore in others my original blessing? It could change our day, and it could make our day truly a holy day. Amen.